Undercover boss orders apple pie, freezes, when waitress says she hasn't paid rent in 2 months. A small town on the edge of Georgia, a sweltering summer noon. The clock strikes 11:56. Michael Foster, 50 years old, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, white dress shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows, slightly wrinkled khaki pants, and worn brown loafers, pushed open the wooden door of a diner named Harvest Corner Cafe. This place was no stranger to him. A small branch, even considered the lowest revenue location in the New Dawn Cafe chain, a chain he himself had founded. But today, he didn't come as a CEO. No assistant, no entourage, no logo on his shirt to give away his identity. Just Michael, carrying a heavy heart full of questions about the values he once believed in. The glass door closed behind him, a soft chime of wind bells trailing in its wake. Inside, the cafe was steeped in worn wooden hues, faded vintage posters hanging on the walls. A country tune played gently from an old speaker, blending with the soft clinking of cutlery against porcelain and the low murmur of a few regulars. It wasn't crowded. An elderly couple was sharing a plate of stew in the back corner. 2 college students hunched over laptops, their iced teas mostly melted. A middle-aged woman, perhaps a teacher, was marking tests with a red pen. Michael walked in slowly, his eyes scanning every little detail. Every grain of wood at the counter, the handwritten menu board smudged slightly with chalk, even the pastry trays in the display case, still filled with the same apple pie recipe he once insisted must never be changed. He chose a table near the window, where the noon sunlight slanted through the sidewalk trees, casting shadows on the glass like streaks of memory. In front of him was an old wooden table, its faint scratches only visible to those who had once sanded it down by hand. That was how Michael had started. 1 table, 1 chair, 1 apple pie warm with cinnamon. Today, he just wanted to relive that memory. A slice of apple pie. Simple. No special requests. No product testing. No quality inspection. Just a customer, searching for a moment of peace in the pie that had once symbolized a startup dream. And then, just as he placed his hand on the menu, a voice rang out from behind. "That table's only for guests with reservations, sir." The voice wasn't loud, but it shattered the daydream-like atmosphere. A tone-mixing announcement and just a hint of condescension. Michael looked up. The speaker was a young woman, late 20s, loosely braided blonde hair, wearing a beige apron, a name tag pinned to her chest. Linda. Linda didn't smile. She stood slightly to the left, one hand on her hip, her gaze swiftly scanning Michael's simple outfit. Michael responded gently. "I didn't see any sign saying it was reserved." Linda shrugged, without a hint of apology. "We just saved that table for regulars, that's all. Can you pick another seat? There are still some free tables near the kitchen." A short silence. Within seconds, a few customers began glancing over. Michael kept a calm face. He folded the menu, stood up without a word. But his eyes, deep and sharp, as if something long forgotten, had just been recorded again. He walked toward the counter, stopped in front of the pastry case. The apple pie was still there, sitting neatly in its glass tray, sunlight reflecting off the sugar-dusted crust, casting a fragile, crystal-like glow. Michael didn't say another word. He simply stood there, as if listening to something more important than speech. In that moment, past and present seemed to blend into one. The man who once built a cafe chain with his bare hands was now standing at its core, a place where no one recognized him, where no one preserved the spirit he once instilled. And he understood. This lunch wouldn't just be about a slice of apple pie. It would be the final test of the trust he had poured his whole life into. The woman who had just spoken was Diane Keller, midday shift manager of the Harvest Corner Cafe branch. Her black uniform was crisply ironed, hair tied tightly in a neat bun, and her eyes were filled with habitual judgment. She didn't bother asking his name, didn't take a closer look. To her, this customer was just an older man, plainly dressed, not worth a second thought during rush hour. Michael Foster lifted his head. His voice wasn't loud, but every word was measured. "I just want a slice of apple pie and a cup of black coffee. If I need to wait a bit, I don't mind." Diane didn't reply. She turned her back, indifferent, as if she had just brushed off a trivial matter of the day. As she walked away, she pointed toward a young girl standing at the POS machine. A signal. "Lila, window table." Make it quick. But don't waste too much time on it, okay? Lila, about 20-something, wore a faded apron with a barely visible New Dawn logo. She flinched slightly, quickly wiped her hands on her apron, and tiptoed toward Michael. She said nothing for a few seconds. Then, bowing slightly, she whispered, I'm sorry, but would you mind sitting at one of the tables near the kitchen, sir? This one is usually reserved for regulars. Michael looked at her. He wasn't angry, not surprised. He just tilted his head slightly, his eyes sinking calm like the surface of a windless lake. His silence made Leela even more awkward. From the counter, Diane didn't bother lowering her voice. Her words were loud enough for Michael to hear clearly. These kinds of customers order one slice of pie and just sit there for an hour, blocking the good seats. No one responded to that, but the sound rippled out like a wave. An elderly couple in the corner glanced over. A young man placed his coffee cup down, slower than usual, and Lila, her face lowered, her eyes dimmed, as if she had been the one who said those words. Michael picked up the glass of water that had been placed on the table, took a small sip. The apple pie here, is it still made with the old recipe? He asked Lila, his voice unhurried. The question startled her. Clearly, not just any ordinary customer would know about the old recipe of New Dawn, a recipe once held secret by its founders, passed down internally as part of the soul of the brand. I'm not sure, sir. We get the pies from the central kitchen every morning. Michael nodded slightly, quietly. Then he smiled, not at Lila, but at a memory that had just resurfaced. The early days of building a business, the first batches of pie, those times when he handpicked each apple to bake the very first pie in the small kitchen of his first coffee shop. Diane casually walked past again, this time carrying a tray of lemonade for another table. Her eyes swept past Michael as if he weren't even there, but her voice still managed to toss a cold dagger back. Some people have no manners. They just want the nice seats without paying properly. Lila blushed deeply. She turned away, quickly grabbed a menu, and placed it on another table, as if trying to escape the moment. Michael still said nothing. He quietly rolled up his sleeve just a little bit, revealing an old wristwatch with a worn leather strap, a gift he received from the co-founder of New Dawn Cafe over 20 years ago, a worthless object to anyone else except him. He placed his hand on the table, his eyes tracking every movement in the cafe. Under the golden sunlight slanting through the window pane, he saw things that a CEO could never notice. When walking in with a name badge, with an entourage, or during a global Zoom meeting, he saw a young woman forced to choose between honesty and job security, a manager using standards to mask bias, a brand he had once built on fairness, now at risk of collapsing from the smallest things, a side glance, a reaction, an unspoken belief about who deserves respect. The radio still played an old country tune, the chorus echoing the familiar word home, a place where no one is turned away. Michael looked up. This time, there was something different in his gaze. Something had stirred inside him, not anger, but an inner alarm. It's time to return. The slice of apple pie was placed down gently. Lila said nothing for a few seconds. She simply stood there, adjusting a tablecloth that was already straight. As a way to avoid meeting his eyes, Michael watched every movement, her slightly trembling fingers, the way her shoulders pulled inward, and the smile that barely surfaced before vanishing when she took a small step back. He spoke. Is it busy today? The question was spoken in a warm, calm voice. Not forced. Not just polite small talk, but the tone of someone who genuinely wanted an answer. Lila glanced around, then slightly tilted her head, responding just loud enough for him to hear. Not really, sir. But we were told to keep the window tables for guests who pay better. She pressed her lips together right after saying it, as if instinct warned her that she had just said too much. Michael nodded slightly. He didn't look surprised, didn't blame anyone. He simply sipped his now lukewarm black coffee, then set the cup down with both hands, as if preparing for something more serious. This job, he looked up at Lila, is it enough for you to live comfortably? Lila froze. That question dropped like a pebble into still water, and her reaction was the truest ripple. She glanced toward the counter, where Diane was still tapping the POS buttons and chatting with a regular customer. Then she lowered her head, almost whispering, Still haven't paid rent for this month, or last month either. A pause fell on the table like the sound of a pin dropping in a quiet afternoon cafe. I'm trying, picking up extra night shifts elsewhere, sometimes until 1 a.m. Michael didn't blink. He looked at her, as if listening to an old song blurred by rain, familiar notes, but now out of rhythm. His hand rested near the untouched apple pie. A slice scented with cinnamon, crisp on the edge, soft in the middle. But now, it meant little. The story was no longer about apple pie. It had become a revelation. Unfiltered, not an accusation, but enough to make the founder of a brand wonder, where did things go off track? Lila still stood there. She didn't apologize, didn't explain more, but her eyes said everything. She was used to enduring. Michael took a soft breath, then reached out to unfold the corner of a napkin, a simple motion to steady himself. He tapped his fingertip lightly on the side of the cup. How long has it been since you had a full day off? Lila chuckled, but it wasn't the happy kind. Probably, since last year. I work from 6 a.m. to nearly 4 p.m. here, then head to a convenience store near 5th Avenue until midnight. And when do you eat? She looked up at him. No answer. How long have you been skipping lunch? He asked again, his eyes fixed on her face. This time, the question made Lila lower her gaze, as if she herself didn't want to know the answer. Usually, I just eat leftover pastries at the end of my shift. Some days I don't eat at all, but I'm used to it. Michael clenched his hands slightly. Not out of anger, but out of something deeper. Shame. Not for the young woman standing in front of him, but for the very system he had created, a system born with the promise. New Dawn is where no one should have to sacrifice themselves just to keep a job. Lila forced a faint smile. I'm not trying to complain. I know some people have it even harder. Michael cut her off. Gently, but firmly. It's not because others have it harder that you must stay silent. You should never have to choose between a job and a meal. The second silence fell. This time, both remained quiet. Only the soft hum of the air conditioner above and the faint clinking of cutlery at a distant table. Michael looked around. Then his eyes stopped at a very small detail. A monthly payroll chart, loosely pinned in a corner, almost intentionally placed where few would notice. The numbers were so small, they made him frown. He turned back to Lila. At this branch, who decides the schedule and shift assignments? Mostly the manager, Miss Diane. As for the pay, we're not really sure how it's calculated. Some months they deduct for being 3 minutes late. Other times, there's no explanation at all. Michael nodded again. But this time, the nod wasn't agreement, it was acknowledgement. He took out his phone and checked the time, 12:21. And within him, a thought was already clear. This cannot wait until tomorrow. Michael slipped the phone back into his pocket, but instead of standing up, he leaned slightly forward, his eyes lingering on the payroll chart for one more beat. He counted 8 vertical columns: employee name, hours, amount, notes, deductions, reason, shift code, signature. Each note line was smaller than a fingertip, yet deducted hours of pay. One detail stood out. Note, 4 minutes late, 2 hours deducted. Not once, but for 6 different employees. Michael furrowed his brow. His eyes darkened, though his face remained unchanged. He turned back to Lila. This time, his voice was almost a command, no longer a question. Do you have a phone? Lila nodded. She pulled it from her apron pocket. Take a picture of that payroll sheet for me. The whole thing. Don't miss a single line. Stand from this angle, the lighting is just right. She hesitated. I'm afraid Diane might see. Michael gave a small nod. I understand, but I need the evidence. And you haven't done anything wrong. Lila bit her lip, then walked slowly toward the corner of the cafe. As she stood snapping the photo, Michael took a small business card from his wallet and scribbled a note on the back in his own handwriting. Call me tonight. Use this number only. Lila came back, 3 clear photos in hand. Michael took them without opening the images. He simply nodded. Thank you. This is for you. He slid the card toward her, face up, the handwritten message visible. Can I ask what this number is for? Michael looked at her, and for the first time his gaze wasn't quiet. It held determination, not anger, but sharp, like a thin blade slicing through excess paper. It's the number I use when I have to fire someone and hire someone new. Lila gently gripped the business card in her hand. She didn't ask anything more. didn't say another word. But something unmistakably had changed. Just then, the soft chime of the cafe doorbells rang, a breeze drifting in. Diane spun around, frowning when she saw Lila still near table 3. "Lila, what are you standing there for? Go clean table 5. Customer just left no tip." Michael hadn't turned around. He was still looking at Lila, and this time, his gaze seemed to speak for her. "It's okay. Things are going to change." And she understood that. No confirmation needed. She bowed slightly and walked quickly toward the counter, but this time, not with hesitation. The business card in her pocket felt like a small key, unlocking a door she never thought she'd be allowed near. As for Michael, he turned back to the slice of apple pie in front of him. His hand touched the edge of the plate, then gently slid it aside. He wasn't hungry anymore. He was calculating something else now, the pace of reform, and which part of the system would need to fall first. Because if a single payroll sheet could strip a girl of her lunch, then that's not a payroll. It's a weapon of oppression, disguised as procedure. And Michael Foster hadn't built New Dawn Cafe to let something like that stand. Michael pushed back his chair. The legs slid gently across the wooden floor. Not rushed, not angry. He rose with the calm of someone who had made up his mind long ago, every step pressing into the thick, heavy air of the cafe. He walked straight to the order counter. Diane was still bent over, reviewing tickets from the POS machine. Her eyes scanned the printouts, unaware of the man now standing right beside her. Michael didn't need to introduce himself. He simply took out his phone. The screen lit up beneath the ceiling light. His fingers moved quickly, decisively. He raised the phone to his ear. "Rachel, activate emergency protocol. Branch HCP DOS." One beat of silence. Then a calm, professional female voice replied, "Order received. System is switching to live monitoring mode. Internal audit team will arrive within 40 minutes. All camera footage, POS records, shift logs, and time tracking are being uploaded to headquarters." Michael didn't respond. He gave a subtle nod as confirmation, then hung up. No one in the cafe had heard the full conversation, but something in the air had shifted. A few customers turned and whispered. One person set down their spoon, eyes narrowing. The scent of freshly baked pie from the kitchen no longer drew any interest. Michael looked straight at Diane. "Do you know who I am?" The question dropped like a splash of cold water in the middle of a summer day. Diane looked up. Her eyes scanned him quickly, as if judging the overly simple outfit, the unstyled salt and pepper hair, the worn-out watch that gave no hint of status. She smirked, a slight tilt of her lips, laced with a touch of arrogance. "A troublesome customer?" Michael didn't smile back. His voice rose from deep within, low, clear echoing across the cafe. "I'm Michael Foster, founder of New Dawn Cafe." A soft gasp was heard near table 4. An elderly guest froze mid-sip of coffee. A server stopped mid-step, as if turned to stone. Lila, by the sink, gripped the metal tray, her eyes locked, stunned. Michael paused for a beat, then continued, "And you've just discriminated against your own CEO." That line didn't need to be shouted. No dramatic gestures required. But the weight it carried was enough to drain the color from Diane's face. Her lips pressed together. Her hand still rested on the POS terminal, but had lost the strength to press another button. No one moved. No one spoke. The cafe sank into a strange silence. Not out of fear, but because everyone felt things had just slipped far beyond their control. Michael no longer looked at Diane. He turned to face the entire cafe, his gaze sweeping over every employee. "I don't care who here thinks they're doing the right thing, but from this moment on, every member of the morning shift is temporarily suspended." A server carrying coffee stumbled slightly. Another worker, around 30 years old, reached up and removed their apron, as if still in disbelief over what they just heard. Michael continued, "This cafe will shut down for the next 48 hours. I'll personally conduct a full review, from table reservation policies, shift assignments, payroll handling, to how you treat customers and your coworkers." Diane opened her mouth to speak, but Michael raised a hand. Not harshly, not interrupting, just a simple gesture, yet strong enough to stop a storm. "No need to explain, because nothing you say now will change what I've seen with my own eyes and heard with my own ears. He pulled a small printout from his jacket pocket, The very payroll record Lila had photographed and sent to the central printer. Michael held it up in front of Diane. Docking 2 full hours of pay for being 4 minutes late. 6 employees this month. No warning. No public acknowledgement. And all of them were those who stayed silent. He stepped aside, pulling back a small curtain that had been covering half of the cafe's posted policy board. Behind it was a timekeeping regulation notice. The handwriting visibly altered in red ink. With no official seal from headquarters, Michael looked around. I want everyone to understand this. No one, I repeat, no one. In New Dawn, Cafe is allowed to twist regulations into tools of manipulation. He paused, staring directly into Diane's eyes once more. His voice slowed, every word deliberate. And no one, not even someone with the title manager, has the right to turn a girl trying to survive into a target of blame. Diane stepped back. Her arms dropped. Her eyes reddened, but no tears fell. It was a quiet collapse. At the table near the door, a man whispered, "He's really him." Michael didn't respond. He turned to Lila, still standing frozen by the counter. He didn't need to say anything. In that moment, the truth spoke louder than any evidence. The noon sun had begun piercing through the cafe window. Its rays fell upon the rustic wooden table that, just minutes ago, he had been asked to leave. It now sat empty, but seemed to be waiting for something else. The beginning of reform. Michael returned to the table, where his apple pie had gone cold, but he didn't sit. He gave it one last glance, as if marking a chapter's end, then walked slowly toward the small door at the back of the cafe, labeled staff only. No one stopped him. The door swung open beneath his hand, as if it too knew. There was nothing left to hide. Behind it, a narrow hallway led to the staff area. Lockers, a time clock, a corkboard covered in crooked sticky notes. Michael stopped in front of the electronic time clock, the very one he had approved 2 years ago, hoping it would help staff log their shifts fairly and automatically. But now, he stared at the screen with a bitter feeling. The display read, "Enter employee code to access." He typed in a special sequence, a high-level access code, held by only 3 people in the entire system. The screen changed. View full shift history last 30 days. He scrolled down. Names appeared one by one, each with a clock in time, clock out time, total hours, and deduction notes. Then he stopped. Name, Lila Green. Dates, Chi, C, T. Every day, she had clocked in at 5:58 a.m., yet all those days carried the same note. Deduct 0.5 hours late arrival. Reason, failed to meet 10-minute early arrival standard. Michael clenched both hands inside his coat pockets. Not meeting the 10-minute early arrival standard. There had never been a corporate policy requiring employees to arrive 10 minutes early just to be considered on time. And this was clearly a rule modified internally. Michael tapped another key. Opening the edit log of shift policy changes, the first line appeared, Manager, Diane M., 28 days ago, updated requirement. Employees must arrive 10 minutes before scheduled shift to be counted as on time. First, no internal announcement, no feedback from the training system, a silent change. And the result? No fewer than 14 employees had hours docked in succession, most of them working off-peak shifts, with no access to central office communication. Michael turned, moving quickly toward the locker unit. Each locker had a handwritten name label, taped on with old masking tape. Lila's locker was at the very end, its tiny padlock already rusted. But what caught his eye wasn't the locker itself. It was the printed sheet taped beside it. A cheap printout. No employee may take breaks longer than 10 minutes during shift. 2 violations per month equals shift reduction. No issuer name. No red stamp. No signature. He took out his phone, snapped a photo. Then his gaze landed on the whiteboard next to the T station, where weekly shifts were assigned. One line had just been added, scribbled in correction, fluid in the bottom corner. Lila, moved to evening shift, too emotionally expressive. Michael didn't need more evidence. He turned around, and on his way back, he picked up the phone again. Rachel, I need one more thing. Yes, sir? Send immediate confirmation of Diane M.'s suspension from her role as branch manager of HCP 12. And schedule one-on-one interviews with every staff member. I'll be conducting them personally. Understood. Michael ended the call. He stepped out of the staff area, the door closing behind him with a soft but decisive click. As if sealing off a quietly flawed era, Lila was standing near the counter, holding a cup of tea just returned by a customer for being not sweet enough. Michael walked directly toward her. He said nothing, just gently raised his hand toward her, not as a command, but as an invitation. Would you take a walk with me for a few minutes? Lila looked at him, hesitating for a second. Then she nodded, set the teacup down. They stepped out into the bright noon sunlight, angled across the stone-paved sidewalk. The door of New Dawn Cafe closed behind them. But the door to truth had just been thrown wide open. Under the cold ceiling lights, Michael now stood in the center of the cafe, a space that, just minutes earlier, was filled with silence and uncertainty. He was no longer a casual breakfast guest, no longer just a man behind a black coffee. He was the helmsman, the one accountable for it all. His voice rang out, not loud, not dramatic, but each word struck the walls with quiet authority. Effective immediately, all midday shift staff are suspended. This branch will close for the next 48 hours. No one moved. A cup being poured was left unfinished on a table. A printed receipt still hung in midair from the POS machine. The Seasoné.com. Michael took one step toward the center of the cafe, his leather shoes barely making a sound on the wooden floor. But the quiet footsteps echoed through air that had turned heavy. I will personally oversee the full review and retraining of the entire team here. No deflection, no sanitizing mistakes. No one is shielded by title or rank. His eyes moved across every face. Those near the kitchen, those clearing tables, those who had just taken off their aprons. No one could avoid that gaze. Not out of fear, but because, for the first time, it felt like someone was truly standing on their side. He turned toward Lila, who still stood frozen, gripping the edge of the counter, as if afraid this moment might shatter like a fragile dream. Michael looked at her, his gaze softening gently. Starting today, you'll serve as the internal operations assistant at this branch. The room seemed to pause for a beat. You'll work directly with me and help supervise all operations, from shift scheduling to how new staff are treated. Lila opened her mouth, trying to say something, but the words caught in her throat. She just gave a small nod. For the first time since the morning shift began, her eyes didn't look away. They no longer held the timid look of a server fearing being called out, but the gaze of someone who had just been entrusted. "A moment à terre," she whispered. "I won't let you down." Michael gave a small nod. No smile, but in that nod was a warmth that spoke the words he didn't say aloud. "I know you won't." Then he turned back to face them all. Diane had left the cafe after signing the temporary suspension order. It was a necessary decision, but not the end. There were still fractures to heal, silences to name. Michael looked toward the kitchen, where the head chef, a salt and pepper-haired man, stood leaning quietly against the doorframe. His eyes were red. Michael walked toward him and reached out his hand. "I need you to stay." Shuan. The chef looked at him for a moment, then grasped the hand firmly, as if holding on to something greater than just a handshake. A chance to be heard. Michael turned back to the rest of the room. It continued speaking, this time slower, his voice almost a whisper, yet not a word was missed. "If any of you have ever been forced to work overtime, underpaid, or threatened with shift cuts, come speak to me directly. No intermediaries." Ovid. The cafe fell into a moment of silence. But the response didn't come from words. It came from the smallest movements. A young waitress bowed her head, tears sliding down her cheeks in silence. A male server removed his apron, not to walk out, but to stand firmer. A janitor in the corner, who had pretended not to hear anything until now, paused her mopping, looked up. Her gaze lit up. Michael didn't say another word. He understood. True change doesn't come from promises. It begins with listening, and in that moment, Lila stepped forward. "I know who needs to be heard first. I can start this afternoon." Michael turned to her. In his eyes, a softness, something deep and unspoken, as if he saw his younger self in her face, someone who also began with just a dish towel over the shoulder, dreaming of building a place where people came first. "Not profit," he nodded. "This afternoon, we begin." "Au Ray." As Michael and Lila shared a final look, before restarting everything from scratch, A sharp sound came from behind the counter. Click. The order tray slid out of the POS machine, spitting out a fresh receipt. No one touched it. Everyone froze. It was an order from table 6, but no one was sitting there. Michael walked over, picked up the small slip. His eyes skimmed the printed line. 1 slice of apple pie, 1 black coffee. No need to serve, just listen. I Dan. Below that, in shaky purple pen, the handwritten words were smudged. I'm the janitor. I reported being underpaid. No one responded. I have proof. Michael looked up immediately. Lila had seen it too. Her face went pale. Her eyes filled with panic. Sir, that receipt couldn't have come from a customer. I know, Michael replied quietly, but in his voice, there was a new tone, cold and focused. He turned to Lila. The internal cameras. Can they trace who just sent this order? She nodded, rushed to the small monitor beside the drink station, where temporary camera footage was stored. A few quick gestures. She rewound the timeline. On screen appeared a woman in a dark gray uniform, her head high, walking past the POS. Not a customer, but a janitor. Name, Marissa. No one noticed her before, because she always walked with a mop, always kept her head down, always appeared, then disappeared like a shadow. Michael said nothing. He just stared at the image on screen and asked, where is she now? A voice echoed from the end of the hallway leading to the back storage. I'm here. Marissa stepped out, her back still slightly hunched out of habit, but her eyes no longer avoiding contact. In her hands was a worn folder, its plastic edges cracked, bound with a stretched-out rubber band. Michael gestured for her to come forward. Marissa trembled slightly. She opened the folder. Inside were printed copies of payroll sheets, shift logs, and a handwritten record, a list of 12 employees over the past 3 months, all of whom had their hours cut without notice. I tried printing this and submitting it to management last month, but they told me to go mop the floors. This isn't your place. Her voice was hoarse, but her gaze stayed steady. Michael reached out and took the folder. He flipped through each page, signs of manual edits, work hour entries crossed out, then rewritten in different ink, and on several sheets, forged signatures under the name Marissa. Signatures that clearly weren't hers. Lila stood silently behind, her hand covering her mouth. Another employee turned to look, for the first time realizing that in a whole year working here, they'd never heard Marissa say more than 3 sentences. Michael placed the file on the counter, then looked directly at her. Thank you. Marissa's eyes widened. Really? Michael nodded. You didn't just report misconduct. You've just handed me the key to investigate the entire phantom hour-cutting system. We've never had enough proof to expose until now. Michael turned to Lila. Have HR from headquarters meet with her early this afternoon. She'll help clarify everything regarding the payroll records. End of 5. A strange moment. Marissa gently adjusted the bun behind her head. Habitual gesture, but this time, it carried confidence. Her posture seemed straighter, firmer. Lila stepped forward and took her hand. For the first time in this cafe, no one saw Marissa as just the cleaning staff. She was now a key witness, an essential part of this path to make things right. Michael looked around at them all. No one is ever too small for their truth to be ignored. And he enunciated every word, his eyes steady on the people in front of him. And no one is ever too quiet to become the one who changes everything. Michael walked slowly toward the door. The sound of his shoes against the tile stretched out each emotional beat of a day that seemed ordinary, but was ending with the deepest fractures. Not cracks on tile or wood, but cracks in trust, in the values he once believed this system he built would always uphold. The glass door of New Dawn trembled gently as his hand met the handle, cold, very cold. Not because of the weather, but because of everything he had just witnessed all morning, and at that very moment, behind him, a sound rang out. Soft, clear, a round of applause. Michael didn't turn immediately. Another clap, then another, not thunderous, not dramatic, but in each clap, there was something deeply human. Recognition, gratitude, and hope. He paused. Reflected in the door's glass, he saw the faces. The head chef nodding quietly. Leela standing beside Marissa, their hands still clasped, like a silent vow. a young waitress wiping her eyes with her sleeve. And in the far corner, the cleaning woman once deemed invisible, watching him, her eyes red but steady. Michael placed a hand over his chest, where his heart still beat heavy. But now, it wasn't just anger at injustice. It was awakening. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel like just the founder. He felt like someone truly accountable. He opened the door. The midday sun shone directly on his face, bright but not harsh. The scent of apple pie from the back kitchen still lingered in the air, blending with the fading aroma of coffee, left untouched on the table. On the sidewalk, he paused. Outside was still, in stark contrast to the storm that had just erupted inside. Michael looked up at the sign, New Dawn Cafe. The slanted sunlight reflected the logo onto the glass like a wavering mirage. As if the entire cafe was staring back at itself, he stood there for a few seconds, long enough to hear the wind brushing through the trees across the street, long enough to feel the weight lift from his shoulders after an entire system had been corrected, with nothing but a slice of apple pie and a quiet confession. Then he turned away, no need to look back, because he knew those who remained would know how to rebuild if given the right trust, and this time he would walk with them. Justice is not a slogan. It is an act. Not everyone who holds a title deserves power, and not everyone who mops the floor is invisible to the truth. Sometimes it takes only a slice of apple pie, one person asking, "Are you making enough to live?" and another brave enough to whisper through a receipt that their hours were being cut. That's all it takes to peel back the polished surface of a cafe and reveal the shadows beneath. Truth doesn't shout. Justice doesn't wear designer clothes. It only needs someone who's willing to look it in the eye and not turn away. Michael Foster did not turn away, and because of that, an entire branch was given a second chance.